Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this one-hour broadcast is World Watchers. It is program number 814, August the 13th, 1987. You heard the testimony this past week. I hope you were listening. And the news accounts of Oliver North talking about the secret team. And I wonder how you're enjoying the Iran-Contra affair and the parade of witnesses of the secret team. We've seen Richard Secord and Robert McFarlane, Gaston Segur, Robert Owen, Adolfo Calero, John Singlaub, Ellen Garwood, William O'Boyle, Joseph Coors, Elliot Abrams, Robert Dutton, Felix Rodriguez, Louis Tams. Thomas Castillo was not visible. He's a CIA agent in Costa Rica. His name is Jose Fernandez. He went into private session. And there was Albert Hakim, David Lewis, Breton Skironi, Fawn Hall, and, of course, Oliver North. And in the weeks to come, this week, Admiral Poindexter, George Shultz, Caspar Weinberger, and Edwin Meese will be following Oliver North. We will not see in public Michael Ledeen or Chichi Quintero or Tom Posey or Jack Terrell or John Fires, Ian Fires, Robert Earl, Donald Gregg, Jeb Bush, the son of George Bush, and John Hall, Robert Brown, Robert K. Brown, Bo Hypak from Reverend Moon's organization Causa. Carl Spitz Chanell won't be there. Richard Miller won't be there. They've both pleaded guilty already, and they're not going to interview Thomas Kleins or Linda Jewell, Guell, the secretary from Western Goals. And the Vice President of the United States, George Bush, refuses to be questioned on these matters, but matters are closing in on George Bush. This past week, with the Oliver North testimony, you saw his very capable attorney, Brendan Sullivan, fighting and sparring there with Arthur Lyman at the table and doing a very good job of representing Oliver North all the way through this whole thing until he throws it on the laps of the people above him and around him who went along with it. And then when it came down, said we never agreed with it. And Oliver North made some very good points about these people conducting it like a baseball game, and they select their teams. And his words were very, very pertinent to the way they select their witnesses and their people. Brendan Sullivan was an attorney for the Army for the Judge Advocate's Office in 1969, 1970. And there was a trial out here in California. People in our area remembered very well. Back east, it didn't get the wire service it should have. It was called the Mutiny trial. 27 defendants were on trial for sitting on the lawn and objecting to the way they were treated at the stockade. And a friend of theirs among the group was murdered by the guards at the stockade about 10 to 15 feet from where they all were. And they sat on the lawn up in San Francisco and asked for Terrence Hallinan, the attorney, and wanted their rights represented, and they were charged with it was really a mutiny trial because they sat on the ground and asked to be represented because of their conditions there. There's a book called Unlawful Concert, an account of the Presidio mutiny case by Fred Gardner. It came out in 1970, published by Viking Press. And one of the defendants of the 27 in the case, his name was Richard Lee Gentile, and his mother stayed at my house during the whole trial. And Brendan Sullivan represented him and one other person in the case. And he was a very good attorney for these people. It was the first sentences were 14, 15, 16 years in the stockade. When it was over, and because of the political activism of persons on the Monterey Peninsula, and I was very active going every day to the trial, the sentences were reduced. Out of the 27 mutineers, as they were referred to in the Army, there was a group that had tried to commit suicide. The conditions were so terrible. So in a 6-month period, there were numerous attempts of suicide, of hanging, cutting arms, drinking lye, cutting wrists, cutting throats, drinking shampoo, metal polish. I'll do more on that trial because it was a very interesting trial. But I want to get on to the Iran-Contra affairs now, just to say that Brendan Sullivan was out here. Instead of having the trial in San Francisco, they moved it to Fort Ord because they could isolate the hearings, whatever trial. It was a small room, and just people from Carmel that they thought wouldn't be interested, but we did turn into a team. And as activists, they had us photographed every day when we went in. Helicopters were over the buildings. and they took our licenses, and I took a picture of the man taking my picture, and we went into those computer files of Western Golds that are now in the hands of Carl Spitz Chanell and John Singlau. Those were the pictures of law-abiding citizens that Reagan had turned the army on to get these protesters. We weren't hurting anybody, and the conditions certainly warranted the attention that it got. But those files went directly into the computer from Los Angeles Police Department, as I say, into Western Golds. Last week I just gave a few reasons why I believe the president is mentally sick and off his rocker as a leader and as a person, that he's really gone. And this week you might have seen all the quotations when Oliver North was testifying, and earlier with the other witnesses. He says he's too busy to watch the show, and he gets himself visibly photographed in the morning, 9 to 10, going out of the White House, and then he probably goes in the back door. He's home by 10, and he's got the rest of the day. But he doesn't recall arms for hostage finding. He doesn't remember what happened. He has no recollection of these events. But the worst part is that he's not interested. That's worst of all. Now, Oliver North was asked questions about his various activities, and at one time he said to Arthur Lyman, "My memory has been shredded." Now, I've done a lot of broadcasts on the control of Candy Jones, and last week I did a 1-hour broadcast in New York at a radio station where Candy Jones is still a broadcaster. And I mentioned to the producer who was going to put on the show that I thought Oliver North had his memory erased like Candy, because when he was asked questions, when Arthur Lyman presented the questions, he would get into the fourth or fifth word, and then the attorney would whisper to him. Then he'd look down to a page, and I believe it was Senator Inouye who said, "Are you reading your answers?" And also Arthur Lyman said, "What's in the book?" And he could have the answers or key speeches to specific questions that they might have even known Arthur Lyman was going to ask, the kind of material he was going to ask, because he would look down at a book. First he was whispered to, and if he was asked about country number 2, he would ask his attorney, "Which one is that?" And he didn't know the code name for the President of the United States that he was using, Joshua. And at other times he'd say, "You tell me," or "That's okay, I'll take your word for it." And all he knew were these patriotic speeches. But similar to the control of Candy Jones, where she was telephonically changed to Arlene Grant and forgot who she was as Candy Jones, the memory can be erased, and he would give these pat speeches with no response, and nothing's wrong, and he didn't do anything, and the Contras needed the money. But the way he responded and whispered all of the time, he was coached. It was clear he was coached. The questions weren't finished when the whispering began, and I believe that he was only allowed to remember certain things, and that he never will remember those other matters that are very important to this story or have any feeling about them, except that the Contras were starving and needed attention, and that he was going to save lives. Saving lives is the biggest lie of the century, and a total contradiction of everything he and the secret team did, but he sincerely believes that to save lives, you tell lies, and he could say that over and over. He also is indoctrinated with a lot of Christian belief that what he's doing is right because God wants it. And there was an article in the Knight Ridder Service San Jose Mercury this past week, syndicated in other newspapers too. This was Sunday, July the 11th, God and Country, a retreat for Christian soldiers. There's a place in Pennsylvania, White Sulphur Springs, a summer camp, a military resort, where people come to discuss Christianity and battle. And this article says perhaps the most famous member of the group is Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, the Marine embroiled in the Iran-Contra scandals, who went to the center 2 years ago. This is at the height of all the operations going on in Iran and the Contra activities. And they pray and study and read the Bible and reconcile it with Christian ethics. So he has absolutely no problems fighting communism, and he goes to this Christian retreat, and besides the military indoctrination, you get a good hunk of the religious, and therefore you can't be doing anything wrong. Now, the secret team, the persons involved with the secret team, were identified particularly, there were several, Albert Hakim and Richard Secord, because the funds that Oliver North and William Casey set up were for Hakim and Secord and their Swiss bank accounts, and they are the persons that are linked to the original Transcomputer International, the corporation set up by Otto von Borschwing that I've talked about for so many years. And it's no coincidence that the heart of the secret team goes back to Otto von Borschwing's network up in Los Gatos, California, set up by Albert Hakim when he came home from Iran and had money from William Simon of the Olin Foundation and could pick up the Otto von Borschwing network in San Francisco. Now, the news accounts tell how Casey relished the secret fund. There's one story here from the San Francisco Chronicle, and I'm sure many of you saw articles in your newspapers to what the secret team is. I'll just quote a few from this newspaper. William Casey embraced the fund set up by the arms sales to Iran. He would use it for secret operations. North denied using the fund meant a CIA outside of a CIA. Well, he could deny that, but it could be a DIA outside of the NSC. William Cohn said this is one of the most serious revelations of our hearings. Senator Daniel Inouye said, the creation and maintenance of a secret government within our government is what this plan is all about. David Bourne of Oklahoma, chairman of the Senate Intelligence, said about the concept of private slush fund, this is very shocking. We really would have a complete loss of constitutional government in this country if you could sell taxpayers' property, set up a fund from the profits so that the president and Congress have no control over it. That, to me, is very alarming. The money was set up in a way that there didn't have to be a presidential finding. Take government property, airplanes, tanks, missiles, hawks, sell it, use the money for your team, use it for other operations, and the president doesn't have to know it. And then, of course, the information came out that retired Major General Singlar, Laub, and Albert Hakim, who managed the Swiss bank accounts with Willard Zucker in Switzerland, that they didn't even have security clearances, or Oliver North didn't even check it. I believe Secord had some kind of a clearance. Hakim never did, and he said he didn't even check it, that they could have secret government devices, they could have weapons out of the Pentagon, and they didn't even need to have clearance. Now, North bragged that the reason for this team is that we could obtain a ship overnight, and William Casey thought that was great, and he said, Casey tells him, we can't find one anywhere else, get me a ship. Well, what do you need a ship overnight for? He didn't say what the ship did. It may send some arms to Iran, but they could have been there, not overnight, but on another method of carrying them there, or airplanes carry them there. These huge airplanes carry them. You don't need a ship, I don't think. Or to bring home one hostage, you don't need a ship. They took the ship over to the Middle East to bring home one hostage. So he's bragging about how fast you can get a ship. Secord can do anything, and North can do anything, but yet they haven't made it clear why the ship was important at all. And Arthur Lyman said these hearings are a celebration of the fact that we have a constitutional form of government. If you accept North's testimony, a secret government within the government is acceptable so long as a superior says so. In this case, I suggested it would be Admiral Poindexter, and even that he assumed the president. But if they say it, then you can do it. And Lyman said you have to understand that the CIA was funded by the United States government. You understood that the government puts limits on what the CIA can do. And I ask you today, with all that you've gone through, he asked Oliver North, aren't you shocked that the director of the CIA is proposing the creation of another organization outside of the one he's the director of to do these kinds of things outside of his own organization? And North said, I could tell you I'm not shocked. I don't see how it's necessarily inconsistent. I don't see how it's necessarily unconstitutional or any way a violation of anything I know. And that's an example of a man not being in his right mind. And there are hospital records of him being at hospitals for mental conditions, and he's had a history of mental illnesses. But I imagine after Vietnam, he was really there just a short time to get all those medals. There was a very good long time to program him like a Candy Jones, so that he doesn't see anything wrong with not needing a president's directive, that the CIA doesn't know, that the agency goes past the Secretary of State and get weapons without the signature of the Secretary of Defense. He's absolutely neutered in the way of response and doesn't know what you're talking about. And the point is that this organization is outside the Constitution, the U.S. laws, and the CIA director should have known it. They went ahead and mined the harbors in Nicaragua without Congress knowing it. And before that, Henry Kissinger was bombing Cambodia during the Nixon administration. They had a book on how to kill Sandinistas. The polite word was neutralize. And the book that Oliver North wrote with the intelligence community said do it as a Christian act. The word Christian is in the book on how to kill people, be a Christian and kill. And Representative Sarbanes said that the goal was really a junta, but the junta has been in place for a long, long time. And he said if people will stop even for a moment and think about that, they ought to be deeply concerned about setting up an operation free of any checks or balances. But these men are slow learners, and this is what we've had for a long, long time since World War II. And they've looked the other way. Howell Heflin from Alabama said there have to be checks and balances. And North said he presented it as the ultimate covert operation. An ultimate operation doesn't have the constraint of democracy. Now, that's the same Oliver North that wanted to put in a martial law plan, stop democracy. This is the same Oliver North who wants to have a democratic group, the Contras, running Nicaragua. And he has been on record working with FEMA, Edwin Meese, and Mr. Gutafera, the persons who set up the original martial law plan, that there's a necessity. It would come about eventually, of course, taking away all rights of persons in the United States. And North said, I'll repeat it again, he presented as the ultimate covert operation. An ultimate covert operation does not have the constraints of democracy. And he's just saying, take democracy and shove it up yours. And then Mr. Secord, who resigned from the Air Force in 1983 because of a Pentagon investigation of him with Edwin Wilson, is checking out weapons from our Defense Department, allegedly left it, and he really hasn't, and can get weapons and then accrue 6, 14, 40 million, whatever he wants in his own bank account after having, for all purposes, left the Defense Department and then becomes a private businessman. And, of course, he and Albert Hakim are holding dear to their millions of dollars of profit. So it's a pretty bad story. The San Jose Mercury has an article, North links the government with a secret government, and it's similar to that, using the profits from weapon shipments to have an organization outside of the CIA. The plan advanced by Casey would have minimized the CIA involvement in covert operations by having them run part of a private network headed by Major General Secord and his partner Albert Hakim of Los Gatos. Well, when Ronald Reagan came in, the first thing he did was to escalate the budget for the CIA and the intelligence community, so there wasn't any need for this. They literally had all the money they wanted. What they didn't want were the checks and balances, because members of Congress may say that's not a good thing to do, that's a bad thing to do. This will insult our allies. We're telling them one thing and we're making a policy another way. They may think we're hypocritical if it's found out. No, they wanted their own government that accounted to no elected person, not even the president, without security clearances and unlimited millions of dollars, referred to as the secret team. North was questioned by Arthur Lyman about the testimony of Albert Hakim. He said that Ronald Reagan was pressuring to win the release of American hostages in Lebanon by the November 86 election for political purposes. And North said, no, that wasn't true, but he was interested in release of them for the State of the Union message. And I wondered if he was throwing that out because of the Challenger and a hint of a blackmail. If you go too far against me, I'll talk about Krista McAuliffe and the State of the Union message. And so the subject, of course, was dropped right away. Now, there's been a breakthrough in the linkage of George Bush to the drug traffic. There are quite a few connections of Bush to the drug traffic, and I think there's going to be more as it comes down. There's some important articles that are coming out about George Bush. In 1982, when he was here in Monterey, at the Monterey Peninsula for the Republican Convention, I've cited this many times, I was handing out these handbills or sheets of paper that were put on the windshield of different cars and different booths at the convention, and among other things, I mentioned CIA Director George Bush headed and once had to control the Australian CIA Nugan Bank. The bank collapsed when Frank Nugan was murdered. 14 other deaths followed immediately. This London Times described the affair as the bank CIA, heroin, and murder. And this came out in the London Times, August the 31st, 1980. And it went on to say that 55 million to 1 billion of CIA dollars from narcotics still were missing. And again, this goes into the till of the secret team. And I said, while George Bush was heading the CIA, they were heavily involved in the Southeast Asian narcotic traffic and drug wars. Now, this past week, actually it's 2 weeks ago now, there's a gentleman in Los Angeles his name is Anthony J. Hilder, and he's on radio station KCZN. It's 1400 watts AM in Ventura. I've done a lot of broadcasts with Anthony Hilder, and he had live on his radio show Lieutenant Colonel Bo Gritz, Gritz, and Larry Trimmer. And they were talking about the Burmese general, Kun Sa, and the Burmese general has made videotapes of the American CIA involved in drug traffic, and he talks about the Burmese leader who has 40,000 men, a private army. He oversaw the opium and heroin traffic of the Golden Triangle, and his testimony, not his testimony, but his video and the stuff that Gritz put on the air goes into Richard Armitage, the current Assistant Secretary of Defense, who was arranging for the purchase of massive amounts of opium and heroin that were sent to this country. And also he talks on this broadcast with Anthony Hilder, and it was on the Ray Bream show in L.A., about George Bush being involved with his narcotics traffic and an Australian bank in where the money was going, that it was a CIA bank, and Bush was CIA director at the time. Well, this is 1987 that this is coming out, and this next week I'm going to do a radio program this coming Wednesday with Anthony Hilder on his program and with Bo Gritz, talking about Richard Armitage, the Assistant Secretary of Defense, the CIA, the Nugan Bank, and George Bush in narcotics traffic and putting the deposits in the Nugan Bank from Southeast Asia drugs. The San Jose Mercury had a story June 5th, 1987, about Bo Gritz. Burmese rebel links the Pentagon official to drug deals. And he also links, Theodore Shackley's involved, part of the Christic Institute, one member of the secret team, and Mr. Armitage from the Defense Department, who went to Lebanon with money for the Defense Drug Agency, the DEA, and Armitage was working with Ross Perot, whose name comes out in the articles currently, and Adolfo Calero, who's been charged with drug dealing in Costa Rica, and he works with the CIA. He's a defendant in the Christic Institute suit. Armitage was traveling to the Middle East with money for the DEA from Calero and with Oliver North, and North has links to the Middle East, to the drug traffickers. I want to do that program soon, the one from Newsday. But the current one in San Jose Mercury says a drug warlord in Burma has accused U.S. Secretary of Defense Richard Armitage and others of drug trafficking to fund their anti-communist operations. In a 3-hour video interview smuggled out of the Southeast Asia with Kun Sa, he said high-ranking American officials were involved in the traffic from 1965 until at least 1979, and that included George Bush and his Australian bank. One of those officials involved, pardon me, in the trafficking is former CIA official Theodore Shackley, and he's the particular person involved with the Iran-Contra controversy. Shackley and Armitage were not available, of course, to be interviewed. Armitage controlled the finances of the drug operation. After Vietnam, Armitage, a prominent drug trafficker in Bangkok, currently our deputy under Caspar Weinberger, was identified by Kung Sa between 75 and 79, 1975 to 79. He was a prominent trafficker. He was part of the American embassy where Armitage established the Far East Trading Company after leaving the American embassy, and that was a cover for narcotics traffic. In his biography in Who's Who in America, the Pentagon official is listed as a partner of the export company, AGT Export Company, in Bangkok. That was the Far Eastern Trading Company. He was there in 1976 to 78. Gritz said Wednesday night he was asked by the White House to contact Kun Sa last October 86, a year ago, and investigate reports that his forces finance their operation through drug trade with the control and knowledge of certain the missing Americans that he went over to look for. Did the drug king know about the missing Americans? He was supposed to locate 4 MIA. Now, James Bo Gritz was the person, the prototype of Rombo that was set up to please Ronald Reagan and Alexander Haig and the teams in the White House. This great Rombo was Bo Gritz. Now Bo Gritz is saying, and turning against his Lord and Master, and saying, you're vice president and you're deputy director of the Defense Department. I learned when I went to look for the missing in action, those Vietnam veterans, he is telling me now because he wants to get out of the drug traffic, and he can't get out because the White House or the American government officials don't want him to stop the drug traffic. The Defense Department spokesman, Major Randy Morger, said that Caspar Weinberger had complete trust in Mr. Armitage, and the staff of CUMSA said Theodore Shackley was the central figure for the American-controlled operations. Shackley is believed to have been brought up with Iran and the possibility of ransoming American hostages. They were involved, Shackley and Klein's, in Chile when Salvador Allende was murdered in the coup there. They were active in with Oliver North and John Singlaub in the Iran and Iran Contra affair, and they worked earlier with Itzko, with Edwin Wilson, and Eric von Marboard, and General Secord with the Egyptian sales that went also to the pocket of their own pockets and accounts, and they're very good at making profit off of government contracts and weapons. Well, this is an article about the CIA. Theodore Shackley, and Kungsa is mentioning the fact that the Vice President, George Bush, was on the head of a bank in Australia where the money for these drug traffics were being defended. Another article, June 5th, 1987, underworld figure accuses U.S. official of drug dealing. Now, there have been quite a few articles about Bo Gritz because he's well known, and Jack Anderson had a story January the 30th, the first of the year, that Texas billionaire H. Ross Perot discussed with Vice President George Bush whether a top Pentagon official should be fired because of his close relationship to Vietnamese woman living in Washington, and the high-up figure was Richard Armitage. Now, when Ross Perot brought this up to George Bush, he wasn't thinking, evidently, or didn't know, let's say, that Bush was depositing the money that Armitage had. There were links of Armitage to the Vietnamese narcotics traffic of Southeast Asia, and Ross Perot, who worked closely with Bo Gritz and Clint Eastwood and the Litton Industries, going for the missing in action. Ross Perot was concerned about the White House because the president's wife was active against drugs. He said President Mrs. Reagan should have an investigation to see the possibility not only that Americans are alive in Southeast Asia, but they were concerned about Mr. Armitage, and the Justice Department said, we're perfectly happy, but off. There's a story in the San Jose Mercury, January the 12th, a long article. Perot reportedly urged a drug probe of the U.S. official, how, besides the Jack Anderson article, how he asked them in the Defense Department and so forth to help find out the drug connections of Mr. Armitage. But again, he had the information on the Bangkok and embassy and the drug dealing, and Theodore Shackley, part of the secret team, and yet the Defense Department said, we're not interested, and the lawsuit was filed. He referred to that in the January article. This was the Christic Institute that was filed May 29th, 1986, and the article said a lawsuit exposed details of the Contra supply pipeline and has taken on new significance since news first broke of the diversion profits of arms sales in the Contras. As defendants in the lawsuit, referring to the Christic Institute, was filed in May 1986, there are several prominent figures in the Iran-Contra affair, such as Major General Richard Secord and the hawkish business partner Albert Hakim of Los Gatos, and Theodore Shackley as deputy director of the CIA, and then he was station chief in Saigon. And his article tells about the seriousness of these people named in a lawsuit in 1969 by the Christic Institute, and they said, we better go into this because the persons mentioned there, Thomas Klein's, a close associate of Edwin Wilson, are linked to drugs, and they thought Shackley and Kleins and Wilson and Secord and Armitage could weaken the American position if they were involved pushing their anti-communist efforts while they're in narcotics traffic. And this came out right after the Iranian story broke wide open. Mr. Hassenfuss had already landed, and this was a very reasonable thing to go into General Vang Pao's monopoly of opium traffic because it linked to persons working for the White House out of the National Security Council that were involved in Southeast Agency. And as I say, Mr. Armitage is still Deputy Director of the Defense Department. So I'll take a 1-minute break and go back to the drug connections that are in the news now because they're very, very important. This is Mae Brussell, and it is side 2 of broadcast number 814. Getting back to the article that was in the San Jose Mercury and also the Boston Globe, January 19th, 1987, this Ben Bradlee recognized the fact that the same people named in a suit filed in May of 1986 the suit was naming the persons involved with drug traffic in Southeast Asia, and the article says that the affidavit says that Theodore Shackley and his deputy Thomas Kleins were sent to Laos by the CIA in the mid-1960s. This is the Christic Institute affidavit. They helped forge an alliance with the Hmong tribe members and helped the Hmong faction of General Vang Pao gain monopoly on opium trafficking. The Vang Pao faction was enlisted by the CIA Army in Southeast Asian War. From 73 to 75, the Christic Institute says Shackley and Kleins were stationed in Vietnam. They directed the Phoenix program, carried out thousands of assassinations of village mayors, civil servants, and remember, Oliver North says that he'll tell lies to save lives, but he's used people who worked with the Phoenix Project and were involved in intense flow with Vang Pao opium money. That's part of the affidavit of the Christic Institute, but then the investigation went further after they had filed the suit in Florida, and the follow-up was now that this opium dealer from Southeast Asia is making tapes, and he's mentioning George Bush, the Australian bank, which is the Nugan Bank, Mr. Armitage, the deputy under Caspar Weinberger, the Defense Department, and he's also mentioning connections not only to Bush and the CIA and the Defense Department, Theodore Shackley, a partner of with Thomas Kleins, of Secord and Hakim, the two people who would form a government within a government without any member of Congress knowing it or any intelligence agency or necessarily not the president. These people are a hair breadth away from the White House. Now, George Bush is linked to that group. He's also linked, and so far he's gotten away, but I don't think this will continue. He's refused to come before the Congressional Committee, at least for the time being, I suppose. But he's very closely linked to Felix Rodriguez. I've had many hours of broadcast on that, and last week there was an article that I shared with you on World Watchers the week before. The $10 million in cash went to the Contras through Felix Rodriguez, otherwise known as Max Gomez, who worked in, and this is very important, who worked in Bolivia with Klaus Barbie, helping with the death squads to kill Che Guevara. And he was a person who was named just a week and a half ago by Newt Royce from Newsday as being part of a $10 million in cash that went to the Contras. The San Francisco Chronicle had an article several months ago, April 27th. North allegedly used ex-CIA men for their flights down to El Salvador. Again, that was Felix Rodriguez. He was close to Donald Gregg, the National Security Advisor to Vice President George Bush, and Gregg had an open door, as did George Bush, for Max Gomez Felix Rodriguez. And these stories about the $10 million going to the Contras are surfacing now. They've been out since April. And I understand this week that Mr. Felix Rodriguez made a deposition on the drug dealing. Warren Hinkle had an article in the San Francisco Examiner a week ago. The CIA, cocaine, and this may be one of the nooses around the president's neck. I'm not going to share the article in detail with you. It's a very good article on the CIA, Southeast Asia, and their secret war in Laos and their mercenary army and opium farmers in Air America, and how good old Uncle Sam was using these cocaine people and CIA airplanes. And so the San Francisco Examiner, Sunday's editorial page, had an article on that. And as I say, July the 7th, I read that ex-CIA men will testify on the Contra drug links. So he's very familiar with them. This is the man who had access in and out of the White House to Ollie North, to George Bush, and to Bush's assistant. There's also an article, May the 6th, 1987, Carlos Letter Rivas, accused of heading a cartel responsible for 80% of cocaine in the United States, said he's willing to cooperate with drug authorities, and he wrote a letter in March to Vice President Bush in an attempt by letter to manipulate the system and send a letter to Bush. Now, Carlos Letter Rivas is the head of the Medellin cocaine cartel, and now I want to go on to that subject because of a very, very important article or series of articles that's been in the LA Times just recently. But George Bush, in summary, and don't forget, is linked to, as CIA director, the Nugan Bank, the opium deposits. He's close to Max Gomez, and has the blessings of Vice President Bush, this fellow, to go in and out of the White House. And this has come through various testimony of people whose names I put on the air. There are many people named as defendants in the Christic Institute whose names are appearing now in other ways, and one of them particularly I'm going to get to right now. I just want to say that Victor Marchetti, formerly of the CIA, wrote a long article for Spotlight, May the 11th, 1987, titled U.S. Spies Face Drug Charges in Iran-Contra Arms Scandal, Explosive Tidbits Leaking. And this is, they have a list of the Christic Institute plaintiffs and the defendants and the drug dealers, and what was formerly leaking out to the somewhat leftist groups and the alternative system talking about the Christic Institute is now making the far right, the middle, the left. And there was a long article in the Los Angeles Times in the main news section just today, or yesterday rather, Sunday's paper, on the Christic Institute, so that it is seeping into the mainstream of, as I say, the right, left, and everywhere else. The role of Eden Pastora, Commando Zero, the plans to kill Louis Tams, the ambassador, and the one that Victor Marchetti wrote for Spotlight has big black letters, CIA called murderers and drug dealers. And again, always the secret team of Secord, Shackley, Klein, Hakim, the people that came out of the Otto von Borschwing network in Los Gatos, California. Now, the article that really is the most interesting, they're not, each one is valuable in its own sake, but they're not equal to the one I'm going to share with you now if you're long listeners. If you're not, I'll go into detail as much as I can for the remaining time of this program, but this is an article that I've been waiting for a long, long time. It's titled One Man's Word Against the World's Most Dangerous Cocaine Cartel. The one man, his name is Max Melmerstein, and he's an engineer who lived in Florida and allegedly was living off of a $30,000-a-year consulting fee. The U.S. government picked him up as a distributor of international cocaine, $360 million worth of drug in Florida and in Los Angeles he was distributing. He knew the book, he knew the chapter on at least 5 bloody killings. He acted as one of the primary operation chiefs in the United States for Colombia's largest cocaine cartel. The law caught up with him June the 5th, 1985, and it was May 29th, 1986, 1 year later, that the Christic Institute filed their lawsuit naming these people as murderers, drug runners, CIA, the very people whose names I mentioned at the beginning of the program, many of them walking in and out of this whole group of the secret team. So 1 year after Mr. Melmerstein was picked up, the suit was filed, and they have defendants not defendants. Melmerstein is a partner with several defendants from the Christic Institute suit. But this is a triage that comes together with another part of the triangle that is really very, very interesting. And I'll tell you quickly what it is and read it in the article. Max Melmerstein works not only with persons involved with the people named in the Christic Institute of the drug trafficking, but the LA Times said that the federal prosecutor said it was the investigation into the automaker John DeLorean's alleged cocaine dealing that that brought charges that to Mr. Melmerstein. The Los Angeles prosecutor said that Melmerstein for years was involved with one of the men DeLorean was accused of dealing cocaine with. Now, we'll get on to DeLorean and some past broadcasts I did of his cocaine coming from Claus Barbie, because Max Gomez dashed Felix Rodriguez with access to George Bush, who's now named by Bo Gritz, and the persons over in Burma, the drug king, as part of the Nugan Bank. The people involved with this scene from Bolivia and the cartel, the cocaine cartel, do now link up to the Christic Institute and George Bush and the Barbie connections because of the closeness of Mr. Rodriguez with Klaus Barbie in Bolivia, and now he's giving an affidavit on his drug connections, giving $10 million of cocaine to the Contra. The article said that Mr. Melmerstein is probably the most single valuable government witness they ever had. He's given testimony to grand juries in New Orleans, Miami, and Los Angeles about the Medellin Colombia cartel. And remember, profits from this also went into E.F. Hutton, where the brother-in-law of the vice president, Scott Pierce, was chairman until just a few months ago, and also into Merrill Lynch, where Donald Reagan was Secretary of the Treasury and then Chief of Staff in the White House. The article says, as a result of Melmerstein's testimony, indictments have been returned against Fabio Osha Vasquez, believed to be head of the Osha family operations, the Medellin group, Pablo Escobar Gaviria, a former Colombian senator who heads the Gaviria drug family, and Rafael Cardona Salazar, the elusive drug kingpin. Together, the Medellin cartel families gross $7 billion a year into the United States. These people have been involved with the murder of Adler Barry Seal. Now, Adler Barry Seal was a person who was supposed to be photographed blaming the Sandinistas for drug traffic, and then he gave an affidavit or several affidavits to the plaintiffs in the Christic Institute suit, Martha Honey and Tony Abergan. And Mr. Melmerstein said that he had told the federal officials in advance of the shooting of Mr. Adler Barry Seal. He had warned them that he was going to be murdered. He warned the United States officials, just like Edwin Meese warned Oliver North that he was going to come in the office the next day, and North had time to shred the papers. Melmerstein warned the U.S. officials that a Medellin cartel contract to murder government witness Barry Adler Barry Seal, is really his name, helped convict the 3 Colombian nationals arrested when Seal's bullet-ridden body was found outside Baton Rouge. Now, he was found outside of there, but the contract to kill him came after he testified. The article said Seal had testified in 1985 against a number of top Medellin cartel leaders, including Jorge Osha Vasquez. That's one of the defendants in the Christic Institute, as well as Pablo Escobar. And Seal was murdered, and Melmerstein told the law officials there was a $500,000 deal to kill him in the United States, $1 million if they could get him back to Colombia alive. And the agents went back to Mr. Melmerstein's home where the bullets were tested before he was murdered. Now, the article goes on, the federal prosecutor said Melmerstein has been more and more involved with the cartel, working directly under Rafael Cardona Salazar, who reported to Jorge Osha. He was responsible for working out the logistics of drugs to the United States and into Los Angeles, and there we get to the DeLorean connections, and arranged flights and location drop points, which again has to then go to William Hetrick and the people around John DeLorean. And the article then goes on, he had sent in approximately $360 million of cocaine in the time that he was heavy into the traffic. He started in 1978 and was arrested in 85. And federal prosecutors said it was, again, the investigation into the automaker John DeLorean's cocaine trafficking activity charges, on which he was ultimately acquitted, that led him to Melmerstein, that led the federal officials to Melmerstein And the Los Angeles prosecutor said MERELSTEIN for years was involved with one of the men DeLorean was accused of dealing with cocaine. So if Mr. Gomez Rodriguez is giving affidavits or testimony about the Medellin cartel, and he has those links into the White House with George Bush, he has the landing Air Force Base, the Defense Department Air Force Base in El Salvador. He works directly with the associates of the Vice President. He's very close to Mr. Gregg and that team. He's very close to Oliver North, who flew down there. And he's now signing these depositions of his $10 million to the Contra and drugs. And he comes from Bolivia, where he worked very closely with Klaus Barbie and the cocaine traffic down there. And it ties into the secret team that the Christic Institute has named that was set up in 1959 by Robert Mayu that were involved in political assassinations, drug running, gun running, and have been together a long, long time. Now, this past week, July the 9th, there was an article in the San Francisco Examiner. Italy's legendary right-winger denies terrorist bombing. That's the title of the article. Also, Francesco Pazienza, a good friend of Michael Ledeen and Alexander Haig, is in jail in Italy for these same charges. These are about Stefano Delle. I've done many, many, many broadcasts on this person. For those of you who have those broadcasts, this will ring a nice familiar bell, some of the material here. For others, I'll just explain it the best I can. The article said, 3 months ago, the Venezuelan authorities delivered over a 51-year-old Italian. The man is Stefano Delle, the reputed Black Pimpernel of international right-wing terrorism. He's been on the run 17 years. He has been charged for involvement in 2 bloody bombings, a murder, and 2 attempted coup d'etat in Italy. And those involved persons linked to the American political assassinations in this country, but I won't digress on that now. Delle said he has worked with secret services of countries, the official government agencies, with right-wing death squads, with Nazi groups in Latin American countries, and with the ultra-right patrons on both sides of the Atlantic. He's been accused with the involvement in a 1969 bombing in Milan that killed 16, and also the Bologna bombing that killed 85 people in 1980 at the train station. However, his testimony raised more questions than it answered, and you can believe it would. Neatly dressed in his brown suit, he avowed his devotion to the ultra-right-wing cause, and see if this thing sounds like Oliver North, because North worked with these teams. The ultra-right-wing cause, he detailed secret trips to Italy, travels to Spain, to Portugal, to Argentina, to Chile, Bolivia, and elsewhere, and he had a close friendship with Klaus Barbie. And, of course, Barbie's death squads, again, are Mr. Max Gomez, who is giving at least $10 million to the Contras, who's affiliated with Bush. Bush is being linked by these strong conservatives, such as Bo Gritz, and these drug dealers in Southeast Asia to the Nugan Bank, which also goes to Shackley, Kleins, and Secord. The web is getting just a little bit closer, but back to Stefano Delle. The bombs that he dropped in Bologna and other places in Italy were placed, he said, by the Secret Service. He thought it was done to unload the responsibility for the attacks and blame the right wing. But the truth was that they were dropped there to blame the leftists and the communists and parties such as the Red Brigade that were set up by the Super Sismi in Italy to come down on the leftists. As for Klaus Barbie, that gentleman who just got a life sentence in France, with whom Delle allegedly worked in a paramilitary and drug protection squad called Fiancés of Death, I knew Barbie. All La Paz knew him and knew who he was. He's a man of great intelligence, and I'm happy to have met him. He denied taking part in military death squads run by Barbie, although Max Gomez did. He's wearing the armband of Che Guevara. He said he wasn't part of those death squads, but he was part of a group to protect the cocaine barons, the regime of General Luis Garcia Meza. Stefano Delle is one of the legendary figures of Italy. He emerged after the Cold War as an anti-communist in a movement following the defeat of Benito Mussolini, an activist since 1950. He helped create the strategy of tension with Otto Skorzeny, who worked with our CIA in the 60s and 70s, whereby neo-fascists attempted to cause enough chaos that their eventual seizure of power by carrying out attacks and provocations would be blamed on the left wing. Now, Operation Chaos in the United States in 1968 to 1972, when Watergate came out, was run under the direction of Richard Nixon and Robert Mardian. Robert Mardian's attorney at Watergate was the same Mr. Green, who represents General Secord. And the Operation Chaos, the COINTELPRO, the strategy of tension, was starting and building up with Ronald Reagan as governor in California from 1966 to 74, and Richard Nixon in Washington, and they were setting up the Garden Plot and the Marshall Plot that Oliver North has been working with Edwin Meese and the Federal Emergency Management Administration. The article says Stefano Delle fled Italy in the 1970s. He worked for the Spanish and Portuguese secret police. He was friendly with the Argentine dictator Juan Perón, then exiled in Spain. He managed clandestine trips to Italy, too. And from Iberia, he went to Latin America in 1974, where he met Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet and ended up working for Pinochet. And, of course, Theodore Shackley and Thomas Kleins and David Atlee Phillips and our top CIA people were instrumental, particularly with the corporation ITT and its chairman John McCone, former director of the CIA, in putting a military dictatorship into Chile. And once it was in there and Walter Rauff and the top Nazis could put on their armbands, this team were in business, and Stefano Delle in Argentina was sending people to Central America until the time of the Falklands War, training those freedom fighters. Oliver North says, I do this to save lives. I will tell lies to save lives. And I want you to know that he was working with Stefano Delle, with Augusto Pinochet, with the Argentine death squads. And this article concludes Delle reportedly returned to Argentina once Perón resumed the presidency in 1973, and he helped establish Perón's personal AAA death squad. He shuttled from Argentina to the Chile that we put in power, to Bolivia, to the Klaus Barbie that the CIA protected until he could be doing his cocaine work, and he shifted around Latin America and took trips back to Italy, and he was involved in a long list of clandestine dealings with right-wing regime, secret service, death squads, and drug barons. In his testimony this past week, he said about his global travels, he only carried out politics. He has the same mind as Oliver North, the new American hero. And now I want to just share with you, there isn't that much time, some outlines I did for broadcasts. I'll go through a few of these names because the secret team came out this past week with Oliver North, and these people come, Hakim and Secord, come from the Otto von Borschwing organization that was originally set up. And in 1983, August, that's just about 4 years ago right now, this coming month, I had 4 broadcasts on this secret team, how they were set up, the links of the office of Arthur Lyman, Simon Rifkin to them, of George Bush, to the Nugan Bank, to narcotics traffic, to John DeLorean and the Klaus Barbie money, and to persons involved with what is identified as the secret team now through the testimony of those witnesses. I've given you their names, and you could hear it on the screen yourself or read your papers. And with the new evidence coming out of the drug connections, I had detailed diagrams and charts with they were sheets that accompanied broadcasts 608, 609, 610, and 611, 4 weeks in August. I won't have time for all of them now. I'll start with program 608, August the 1st, 1983, 4 years ago. On the left is Anton Fritz Kramer, Henry Kissinger, the Counterintelligence Corps, and Klaus Barbie working with top Nazis from 1945 to 47, when Kissinger goes into Harvard. Over in this chart of this same date, I have January 1955. Otto von Borschwing came to this country. In 1959, Helene von Damm came to this country. She made all appointments in the White House when Reagan became president, both for the 1981 administration and the 1985. So she worked with Oliver North and Secord and Hakim. Hakim knew her from international imaging, and I understand from one article she in Vienna was working with Hakim with their dummy fronts. And I had a 1968 to 74. Reagan was governor in California with von Damm as his secretary, Well, she was the translator for Otto von Borschwing for Trans-International Trans-Computer Investment, TCI. And then I mentioned how she married Christian von Damm, who she kept his name, and she was in Sacramento with Reagan, and he went down to La Paz, Bolivia, became vice president of Bank of America at a time when Klaus Barbie and Mr. Gomez and the cocaine Nazi armies and the Gestapo were training death squads. And then the third part of this diagram I did 4 years ago, dated 1981 to 83, had to do with 20th Century Fox when Marvin Davis bought it, and on the board was Gerald Ford of the Warren Commission and William Rogers of the Challenger Commission, law partner William Casey, and also part of the 20th Century Fox investment, where 50% of it, with Marvin Davis, a big hunk of it, was Mark Rich. And I mentioned several weeks ago that Mark Rich has been involved in shipping oil to South Africa by way of Brunei using Japanese ships to hide the limit that South Africa isn't to get the oil. He's involved in that. And 30% of Fox was bought by Marvin Davis, 50% by Mark Rich, and 20% was owned by Chris Kraft Corporation, the attorney for Chris Kraft being Simon Rifkin. Also, he's the attorney for the Sterling Bank and for Michele Sindona's Vatican Bank. And there are articles that link Michele Sindona and Robert Vesco of this Iran-Contra affair with a linkage to the attorneys and Willard Zucker, the financier in Switzerland, and he's in Cuba with Fidel Castro. The Vesco connections are very strong, and they're also linked to a man named David Graver. On a broadcast, it was in August, the fourth of that series, where I diagrammed the money. I had, at program 610, I had listed over the top, the main institutions or persons with missing money, drug money. In one column, the Nugan Bank of Australia, and that goes into Theodore Shackley, Edwin Wilson, the Bay of Pigs group, those are the defendants in the Christic suit, the CIA Army Intelligence Task Force 157 with George Bush, and $50 million to $1 billion was missing in 1983. Under that, Klaus Barbie and a $7.5 million he wanted from DeLorean, and I listed his connections as cocaine king, dealing in heroin, and with the Bolivia death squads and the banks in Zurich, Switzerland that took the money, and his relationship to people in the Bay of Pigs who are also active. Their names are tied into the Iran-Contra affair. And then the next name was John DeLorean. And you see this Mr. MERELSTEIN case brings up DeLorean's links to the cocaine cartel that worked out. The cocaine came from Bolivia and Colombia. It was combined. One was grown and the other was processed. And I had John DeLorean's connections, and now you see in the LA Times this week that DeLorean, one of the drug dealers he worked with, is part of the Medellin cartel that links to the Iran-Contra people that worked with Oliver North and Robert Owen out of the White House and General C. Court. And the main point is Albert Hakim, the secret team that can take government weapons or government investments, and the Nugan Bank had investments from GIs from Southeast Asia, and keep these monies for themselves and not tell the president. They don't have to have a finding. You're not part of the CIA. Setting up their own Swiss bank accounts, Panama banks, Cayman banks, killing heads of states, killing people in the way of drug information, or people like Adler Barry Seal who are giving affidavits about drug dealers. They could kill them off. And I have John DeLorean in that setup. And next to it, Licio Gelli of the P2, part of the Banco Ambrosiano, the money missing, the billions gone out of the Vatican Bank, and Paul Marcinkus in 1987 is wanted by the Italian government, won't step out forward. And I linked Ronald Reagan and the P2 and Licio Gelli, who was at his inauguration, as part of this same team, and also Mark Rich, again, the man working with the Sultan of Brunei and the Japanese government. I had him fingered with persons in Hollywood and the law office of Simon Rifkin and Arthur Lyman, the Michele Sindona connections to the Sterling Bank. I had that column. And then next to that, the LAPD file, The Computers and Blackmail of Larry McDonald. When this was in August of 83, and Larry McDonald was dead 4 weeks later after this broadcast came out, and I linked him to Henry Kissinger, William Rogers, and to banks in the Netherlands Antilles, and to Otto von Borschwing, and again, the von Borschwing network, the Western Goals that Larry McDonald headed, when he was dead 4 weeks later, went to the Eastern Division, run by, on the board, John Singlaub and George Patton III and Edward Teller and Admiral Thomas Moore, and a lot of the right-wing John Birchers, and that became the Spitz Chanell organization. He took over Western Goals, and Linda Jewell, the GUELL, the secretary for Larry McDonald, is still the secretary at Western Goals. And then among this list of persons and missing monies, I had David Graver, the $17 million out of the American Bank and Trust. He was supposed to have died in an accident, or airplane accident over Mexico, and I linked him to James Earl Ray, and Graver was the one who introduced Ray to Raoul, and I made the connections to the Martin Luther King assassination, which go back to Larry McDonald and Western Goals, and David Graver is in the book Tennessee Waltz. There's a whole lot of that in James Earl Ray's new book that just came out. I just mentioned on the air last week or 2 weeks ago, and I had listed his connections to the Israeli banks, the Israel Bank of Tel Aviv, Argentine Nazi government, and James Earl Ray, and the connections of James Earl Ray, asking with a question mark, to the Zeiger family in Italy. Now, in Ray's book, and I might have mentioned before, and I may mention it every week, Mr. McMillan, the husband of Priscilla Johnson McMillan, who was Oswald's contact and control in the Soviet Union, and Marina's after the assassination, Mr. McMillan asked James Earl Ray, and it's in his book, in the course of his traveling around and meeting with different people, was he familiar with or know of the Nazi Argentine connections to the killing of Martin Luther King? My time has run out now, so I'll have to continue this next week, but I think the Nugan, George Bush, DeLorean, Medellin, Cartel, and the Max Gomez connections are getting more interesting every day, and I think it will just keep developing until a lot of these stories come out. This is Mae Brussell. I'll be back with you next week. Thank you for all the articles you're sending me.